Here is the calcium channel CaV22, also called N-type. It looks like the sodium channel because you can recognize here the 4 domains, similar domains in Roman letters, and the 6 transmembrane segments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the P loop, the pore loop, and the S4, the segment 4, which is made up of a regular sequence of positively charged amino acids, which confers the voltage sensitivity to the protein. And this protein folds, then when it's folded, you have in the middle a pore, an aqueous pore, where calcium ions can go through. The P loop here of each domain, you find it inside at the entry of the pore, and it contains glutamate residues that are very important for the selectivity to calcium ions. To study the unitary calcium current, we choose the cell-attached configuration, to have very few channels under the pipette, and we choose the voltage clamp mode to study a current. Since we are in cell-attached mode, we put extracellular fluid in the pipette. Here we add 110 millimolar barium ions in this extracellular fluid instead of calcium ions. Why do we add barium ions to record unitary currents? Because calcium channels are very permeable to barium ions, and this produces a unitary current of greater amplitude than that produced by calcium ions. We apply blockers of other calcium channels to record only N-type calcium currents. Since we are in voltage clamp, we hold the membrane at minus 80 millivolts. At this potential, there are no calcium channels open. You see here, no current. We apply a depolarizing step to plus 20 millivolts during 200 milliseconds. During this depolarizing step, we record unitary inward currents. Sometimes no current, sometimes a lot of currents, and sometimes again here no current, lots of currents, and no current. I remind you that here are inward currents because they are negative. It's a weak unitary current in the order of 1.5 picoamps, and you see here that the channel opens, closes, opens, closes, etc., etc. To better understand the behavior of the channel, we are going to plot the IV curve, which is the amplitude of the unitary current here as a function of membrane potential. At plus 20 millivolts, here we saw that the amplitude is around 0.5 picoamps. If we now apply test potential that are less depolarized than plus 20 millivolts, here 10, 0, and then they are negative, minus 10, minus 20, etc., etc. The current's amplitude increases. Why? Because we go further and further from the equilibrium potential of calcium ions. The further we are, the larger amplitude is the unitary current. And then we don't record any more currents because channels at these potentials are closed. What are the characteristics of the total N-type calcium current? To study the total current, we record in whole cell configuration to record the activity of many calcium channels, and in voltage clamp mode because we want to record a current. In this experiment, we use calcium as the charge carrier, here 2 millimolar of calcium in the extracellular medium. And we add blockers of voltage-sensitive sodium and potassium channels and blockers of other calcium channels because all these channels could respond to a depolarizing step. And if we want to record the N-type calcium channel alone, we have to block all the others. Here is the depolarizing step that we apply to plus 20 millivolt. After an artifact, we see an inward current, a rising phase, a peak, and a decay phase, and then the artifact again when we stop the depolarizing step. Note that the amplitude of the current decays, though we are still at plus 20 millivolts. This indicates that the N-type calcium channels inactivate. The rising phase corresponds to the gradual opening of calcium channels. They open one after the other, but fairly quickly. We could see here little steps, and when they sum up, this gives the smooth curve. The peak corresponds to the amplitude of the current when all the calcium channels of the membrane that should open have opened, and then we understood that the decay phase corresponds to the inactivation of the calcium channels. To better understand, let's build the IV curve. So we apply depolarizing steps of increasing amplitude, and on the top we record the corresponding currents. And the little arrow here indicates the peak. And the value of the peak is plotted here against membrane potential. The unitary current was linear. This one is not, it's U-shaped. Why is it U-shaped? It reminds you, of course, of the sodium current, of the total sodium current. It's U-shaped because when the membrane is more hyperpolarized than minus 50 millivolts, the channels are closed, so there is no current. Then, from minus 40, minus 30 millivolts, the channels begin to open. And the more the membrane is depolarized by the step, the more channels open in the membrane. Normally, because here we are far from the equilibrium potential of calcium, normally in this value, the current should be very high. Total current equals G, the conductance in the whole membrane for calcium channels, Vm minus E calcium. So here the driving force is very high because we are far from the equilibrium potential, but the current is small because you don't have a lot of channels open. And then at the peak here, you have the maximum channels open, and the decay after is almost linear. It decays in relation with the driving force.